Olivia Carroll has been studying bees for over 20 years in ecosystems around the world. She received her bachelor's and master's from Utah State University and a PhD from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. With Dr. Wilson, she has written 2 books, The Bees in Your Backyard, A Field Guide to North American Bees, and the soon-to-be-published Common Bees of Eastern North America. Joe Wilson has studied bees, butterflies, wasps, and other organisms throughout the Western U.S. He received his PhD from Utah State University. He is a professor of biology at Utah State University, Tooele. In addition to the books, he has co-authored with Olivia. He has also written a children's book about native bees called Bees Are the Best. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, Olivia and Joe.
Hi guys, thank you Grace for that wonderful introduction. Joe and I are both, I think I can speak for you Joe, pretty excited to be here today and get a chance to talk to you. Joe and I have been lucky enough to know each other for, oh gosh, what's it been Joe, 25 years maybe?
Yeah, something like that, long time.
Long time. We met in the field many years ago working on a project that was my master's in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And to give you a sense of bee diversity in this area where we were working, we found over 660 different kinds of bees. Every once in a while, we're still lucky enough to get to work together. Go forward, Joe.
Yep, sorry, I clicked the wrong button.
Still coming back sometimes to meet in the same places where we first got to work together. And it's always good. Even after all these years, we still have lots to talk about with bees. And it makes it really fun to work on books and programs like this together.
I want to interrupt just for a second. I just recognize in this picture on the left, it looks like I'm just looking at my phone, which just seems not cool, but it's because that camera Olivia is holding is projecting onto my phone, and we're trying to look down in the nests of some bees. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like checking Facebook or something while we were out in the field. I just noticed that.
I never really noticed that's what it was because I knew what we were doing. That thing is like a tube that you can stick down into a bee nest to see what's going on inside the nest. It was actually pretty fun and exciting to try that thing out.
It was fun.
All right, so in addition to asking questions about bees, one of the things that we like to do is ask other people what they already know about bees. And so a few years back, gosh, what year was this? I don't even remember anymore.
I don't know. It's about 6 years ago, maybe. Actually, it says 2017. There it goes.
There it is. We actually put out an online quiz. We broadcast it widely to anyone we could find on social media who was willing to participate. And we asked our audience, all of the people who had decided to participate, just 3 questions. And so just for fun, we're going to ask you these same 3 questions and see how you stack up to other people that are just learning about bees. And so we're going to do this fairly fast over in the polls section. Just keep that open because there's going to be 3 questions that come at you kind of quickly here. And the first of those questions is, how many bee species are there in the US? Is the answer 50 species, 100 species, 850 species, 4,000, or 20,000 species? Go ahead and take a minute and put your vote in for how many species you think live just in the United States and Canada. All right, we have 28 votes. I'll wait till it gets up to around 50, and then we'll show you the answer here. Headed up almost to 40. Doing pretty good.
Do I have to vote for it to show me the answers?
Yeah, you do.
No, I'll vote then.
Don't get it wrong.
Yes.
43, almost there. Come on, a couple more. Over in the polls section, you can push on that. There's 44. All right, that's pretty good. So the actual answer, Joe, do you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so we had over 1,000 people answer this question. Most people, and so we have this broken down a little bit differently. We didn't give them a multiple choice answer. We just gave them a kind of an open-ended question. So we had a lot of answers. So we put those in bins afterwards. Most people thought there was less than 500 bee species in the US. In reality, there's about 4,000. And so 63% of you were right. And look, what's really fascinating here is almost nobody thought there was less than 100. And in fact, the majority of our respondents, even though we put it less than 500, most did think there was less than 100. So you guys did really well. But so what this tells us is that most people are dramatically underestimating how many bee species live here in their ideas of what bees are here. So then the next question we asked, so we know people underestimate how many bee species live here. Then we wanted to kind of gauge how well are they at picking out the bees. We didn't really care if they knew what kind of bee it was. In this question, we said, which one of these 10 insects is a bee? And so we'll ask you that too. In this poll question that's up now, you can click multiple ones. So if you think number 1 and number 2 are bees, click number 1 and number 2. And so I'll give you a little bit because there's 10 images to look at. And then when we get 40 or so respondents, we'll talk about the answer. I'm just gonna click some so I can see it. So you have to scroll down and put submit vote for it to work.
Yeah, that's right. Looks pretty good. We have a good audience. I'm kind of impressed.
Some experienced bee
That's right.
thinkers out there.
That's right.
Let's see, so it organizes them by how many people. So we have 34, so 35. We'll wait just a couple more seconds so we don't take too long just waiting. So we know that 45 people answered the first one. I'm waiting for one more person. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click the button, and all of the insects on this pictures that are bees will be circled. Then you can kind of gauge how well you did. So those are the bees. Number 2, number 4, number 6, 7, 8, and 10. Some of you are probably thinking, I knew that, and others are probably thinking, what? Like number 7? And so what we found when we did this survey broadly is most people knew bumblebees and honeybees were bees. Surprisingly, at least to us, a lot of people knew this little sweat bee was a bee. But the majority of people, so less than 50% of the answers, they did not realize this green bee or this blue bee were bees. Might be because on the Honey Nut Cheerios box, you don't see blue or green bees. More people thought this is a velvet ant. It's a wingless wasp. More people thought that was a bee than the real bees, even though this insect doesn't even have wings. But it is orange and fuzzy, so maybe that's the kind of the clue that they thought it was a bee. So if I look at our responses here, it looks like people did pretty well. But I forgot to look at the numbers. So
yeah, no, I think people did great. I see a lot of people, even in our audience, kind of confused number 9. That's an easy one to kind of get wrong if you haven't spent a lot of time with them. And they are in the same group as bees, so I'm not too surprised. What I think is interesting, if you go forward, Joe, one is that on that graph, the ones that people are really good at getting right are also the ones that are most likely to sting you. If you've ever been stung by a bee, it was probably a bumblebee, a honeybee, or maybe one of those sweat bees, the third one that you see there. So
that's a really good point. Also, one thing my kids often think about when I show them this kind of survey is they think, who thought that these last 2 were bees? You know, because there is some percent in there. So this tells us 2 things. Either some people are really bad at identifying bees, or online surveys are problematic in some ways, right? Yeah. So there's probably a little bit of both of that.
Yeah. All of those bees that you saw back there are really common bees that can be found throughout the U.S. They can be found across Washington, D.C. area, all the way up to Maine and all the way down to California. They are widespread, super abundant bees. They're just not things that people are used to thinking of as bees. And so the last question that we asked in our survey was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being super duper important. If bees are essential to life on Earth, and that's number 5, all the way down to 1, how important do you think bees are? And so we're going to ask you the same question. Submit your vote. Don't worry, it's anonymous. If you want to say 1, we probably won't judge. Probably. This was the last question that we asked. I see that we're already at 39 votes. We'll head up. I see, and I think this is the trend that we saw all the way through, was that most people thought bees were very, very important. They were up to 5. A few people said 4, but nobody really went below that on a scale of 1 to 5. Everyone knew that bees are important. So here we have this strange situation where people know bees are essential, but they don't know what a bee is or what a bee looks like. And so Joe and I kind of feel that we're on a mission to try and solve this, because one of the things that we want to try and prevent from happening is directing our efforts towards saving the bees and not actually saving the right organism. So this is a shirt that you can buy on Zazzle. It says "Save the Bees" in giant letters there. And of course, that's the image blown up for you to look at, but that's not a bee. That one's actually a cicada. So really common right now, maybe out where you are, certainly in the Ohio, Pennsylvania region, you can see these cicadas or hear them, but not bees for sure. Here's one more we'll look at real quick. This one's on Amazon. I have 2 little girls, and so I'm always looking at ways to keep them entertained, and I was looking for a puzzle and found this one. Cute little jigsaw puzzle, and it says sunflower, bee, and flower jigsaw puzzle. So that looks really nice. The only problem is that one is actually a fly, not a bee at all. Again, so the issue is that people understand bees are important and worth paying attention to, but they have a hard time recognizing what a bee is.
Exactly. And so Olivia and I have kind of collected these kind of images because over the years, there's a lot of stuff we see. Sometimes they're news articles, sometimes they're puzzles when people are making these mistakes. And on the internet, it's easy for people to make a mistake, right? On Zazzle, I could go upload a picture of myself and say, save the bees, and I can try to sell that t-shirt. So people make mistakes, but it's not just random people on the internet making mistakes. There are some places that should know better. Several years ago, I was at an entomology conference, and I also have some young kids. So I went to this booth that had books for kids. This one was called something about bees. And so I thought, oh, I want to get a book for my kids about bees. I open it up to the front page and it says meet the bees, and there's a big picture of a fly there. So even publishers, and I'm sure that the author probably didn't choose the picture, so we can't blame Tracy Reed. Maybe the publisher just had, who knows who did it, but it's easy to make these mistakes. And one of the most common mistakes we see in this is mixing up flies for bees, because it's easy to get a picture of these flies on a flower. And so if you go to the online picture resources and type in bee, you will probably find some fly pictures. Mm-hmm. Another mistake people make, and we're not going to focus too much on that mistake here, is people focus a lot on honeybees. And what we want to talk about today, I'm going to just go back and forth so we can see this little video again. We want to talk about the native solitary bees. Honeybees aren't native to North America, and they're actually quite different than most other bees. And I'll just mention some of those differences here. So one is in the name, native solitary bee. They are native to North America, most of them. There are some others that we'll talk about. They're solitary. Most bees that live here live by themselves. There's no queen. There's no big hive involved. There's no division of labor with workers and things. And so that's one thing we want to kind of point out, that honeybees are kind of a whole different ball game. They do a lot of things differently. Most bees in North America don't have queens, don't make honey, and most of them don't live in big hives. And that's an important thing to think about. But we do want to talk about some of the features of bees, and we'll do that next.
So I like to do this by talking about bees as if it was like a used car. So I'm going to be your used car salesman here and walk you through the wonderful features that you can find on a standard bee. The first thing I'll talk about is the eyes. Bees actually have a total of 5 eyes, but they're broken into 2 different sets. So the first set is on the side of their face, those real big pretty ones. No eyelashes, but they're still cute. And these eyes can see in 270 degrees all the way around the body, and they have UV capability. So while humans can see from the range of red through purple, bees can see a similar range, but it's shifted down just a little bit to the orange through ultraviolet, which means that when they're looking at a flower, they're picking up on cues that our eyes can't see. So for example, this really pretty flower, and this is from a website online run by Bjorn Groslet, and you should look it up. This is how we see flowers, and this is how a bee would see that exact same flower. So kind of dramatic and pretty exciting when you start putting the ultraviolet in. And just for fun, here's another. This is a ranunculus, fairly common across the US. There's how we see it, and there is how the bee sees the same flower. So that ultraviolet reflectance creates this sort of bullseye in the middle that the bee can hone in on to get to the good stuff, the pollen and the nectar. In addition to those 2 eyes on the sides of their faces, they also have 3 more eyes on the top of their head. I like to think of it as the built-in navigation system, just like we have in our cars now. This allows the bee to orient with the sun, to figure out how far it is back to the nest. And they use these eyes also to detect shadows, so to stay away from, evil bee collectors who are out trying to grab them or take a picture or something. Also found on the body are on the head especially are the antennae. I think of these as the extended floral scent detector. This is how bees smell flowers. They don't have noses, they don't have nostrils, but they do have these wonderful antennae that can collect scent compounds and help them find flowers. Males have even an extra antennal segment, and their antennae tend to be longer. perhaps to help them find females. They actually can smell out female bees using their antenna. It's kind of phenomenal. Also on the body of the bee are built-in reusable grocery bags. This is how they collect all of the stuff that they have to take back to the nest for their offspring. I wish mine were built in. I forget my grocery bags every time. I'm terrible at this. Most bees have them on the underside of their abdomen, or some bees have it on the underside of their abdomen, but a lot of bees also have these reusable grocery bags, also fancily called scopal hairs, on their hind legs. And so if you look at female bees especially, you'll often see that the hind legs are super brushy and covered with this thick hair. That is how they carry pollen back to the nest for their babies. Also on the body, back to the head again, I think of them as face scissors. They have built-in scissors. They don't have to wander around the house trying to find their scissors to do different things. It's actually attached to their body at all times. These face scissors are technically known as mandibles, and the mandibles are used to carry rocks, to chew at nesting material, to cut off pieces of petals or leaves to take back. The ways that these mandibles are used are kind of incredible and very useful. And then, of course, they also have their wings. Let's not forget about those wings. And those wings are important, as Joe will tell us about a little later on, in telling apart bees and flies. So this can be an important characteristic here. And they can use them to fly up and down and frontwards and backwards and upside down in all sorts of different directions. Kind of amazing and super fast. Females, but not males, have a sting at the very rear end of the body. The sting is actually a modified ovipositor. So bees that lay eggs, oviposit means egg layer. Bees that have this are the females, and females have a sting, and so they're able to sting. Unlike the honeybee, which loses its sting when it stings you, these bees actually can sting you multiple times, but it's never as painful as the honeybee happens to be. Thank
And
goodness.
I just want to mention here that you probably heard Olivia say sting multiple times there for a second and thought to yourself, that sounds weird. So the official term of that structure is called the sting.
Yeah.
And so it can be a noun and a verb. A bee will sting you with its sting. We often say colloquially stinger, but officially it is just called the sting. So in case you're wondering, why did Olivia say sting with the sting? She's right. And something to think about.
Thanks, Joe. That's exactly right. Yeah, I forget that sometimes. A couple more things we'll point out. We're almost done with the bee body parts here. On the face, underneath those mandibles, they also have a whole slew of other mouth parts that they use to paint the walls inside their nest. They can use them as a straw to suck up nectar. They can sort of sense and quote unquote taste the world with this, and they can lap up even sweat or tears from your body using these mouth parts that they have down there. And then finally, last but definitely not least, on the body of a bee, there are 6 legs, and the legs have so many amazing functions. They can climb and walk with them. They can crawl around inside tiny nests. They can sense the electromagnetic forces coming from flowers, and they can clean their antenna. They have special little antenna cleaners on here. They have built-in knee pads. They come standard. And then they have water landing capabilities in some. This, of course, is optional, and not all bees can do this, but some bees can use those fancy legs to land and float on top of water. They're pretty incredible creatures.
So we have one more poll question here. So we've talked about the features of bees. We want to talk about how we recognize bees before we get into some of the specifics. So in this poll question, it's going to say how many of these insects are bees or something to that effect. How many of these images are bees? And so there's 10 images here. If you think 5 of them are bees, click number 5 and so on. So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that, or a couple seconds, not minutes. So I'm going to answer it too. Maybe I should answer it wrong just in case. So this can be tricky. I'll just talk over it while you guys are looking at these all. So these are a lot of, the reason we put this slide together is because these are various insects that as we've been out in the field or in our yards or in our classrooms, these are what people call bees most of the time. And my hint is not all of these are bees. So so it's not all 10. And I apologize for those of you that have already answered. I gave you my hint. Yeah, these often get confused for bees for very good reason. They look a lot like bees, and some of them are bees. So I'm just going to wait a couple more seconds. We have 39 votes currently. And it'll be interesting to talk about it in 10 seconds. 5 seconds.
A couple more votes trickling in here.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, that's about where I've been answering before. So, drum roll. This is the only one that is a bee. So the answer was one of these insects is a bee. And a lot of you are probably thinking, based on the poll results, wow, like there's a lot of those that look like bees. So we want to take a little time here to talk about how to tell the difference between a bee and these other insects. So these are all flies or wasps, except for that circled bee. So let's start by talking about the difference between flies and bees. Sometimes when we're in a small group in a not online setting, we'll ask people, what are some differences you see here between a fly and a bee? Sometimes we'll ask which one is the fly and which one's the bee. So if you're sitting here thinking, okay, I've seen one of these pictures in the past, and this one on the bottom left is the bee that we've been showing you. So let me point out some of these features just for the sake of time. So I often focus on the face. To me, and to my kids too, when we're in the yard and we see something that could be a bee or a fly, we look at the face because some really key characteristics can be found on the face. One of these is the antennae. Olivia talked about those antennae being like the sensors. They're smelling and they're doing other things with that. Bees have longer antennae. Flies have really short ones. And officially, what you can count the number of sections in the antenna. Bees have 10 sections up at this upper part of the antenna. Flies only have 3 total sections. There's a little teeny one, this flat one, and then that hair counts as one. So flies have 3 sections, bees have more than 10. Another thing is the eyes. A lot of these flies that look like bees, the eyes are just huge. They fill basically half of the whole head. Bees' eyes are relatively smaller. The whole head and face is not filled by that big compound eye as much as it is with the fly. Additionally, besides the head, you can look at the legs. Flies usually have skinny, relatively smooth legs, no pollen collecting hairs on those legs. Bees, and a lot of bees, have thicker legs, and then their hind legs, for many species, have kind of stout pollen collecting hairs like you see here. And then lastly, this feature I don't use as much when I'm in the field, but it is a true fact that flies have 2 wings and bees have 4 wings. The reason I don't use that is because it's hard to count the wings, either when it's flying around or when it's landed on a flower, because the bees fold their wings over each other, so you can't tell if there's 4 or 2, but it is a true fact. So if you look at the face and you look at the legs, you can tell if it's a bee or fly. So I have a couple.
Can I add one thing here on this that we didn't talk about? And that's that when you take a moment and look at that bee compared to the fly, I would say the bee's a lot cuter. It's just it's pretty adorable.
I agree. So when my first kid was born, Olivia sent us a stuffed animal toy of an isopod. It's a roly-poly, I don't know what you call them, potato bugs. Super cute little stuffed animal. We still have it and love it. And I always think someone should make a stuffed animal of a bee.
I know. Right?
That's like a teddy bear, right?
Yes, they do.
The fly, not so much. I mean, I would still have it if someone gave it to me, but. So here's a quiz. This is not a real poll question. This is just for you to mentally think to yourself, okay, based on those questions Joe just told me, those features Joe just told me, is this a bee or is this a fly? So I'll just let you think to yourself for a second. And you're probably, hopefully, thinking to yourself, that is definitely a bee. Yeah. Look at those eyes, look at that antenna, and look at those pollen collecting hairs on the back legs. Those are like chaps, right? That is definitely a bee. Next one, how about this? Give you a couple seconds. So what you should be looking at is the legs. Well, I don't see any pollen collecting hairs. Okay. The eyes, they're pretty big, but they're not huge. But those antennae, yeah, those are pretty short antennas. So yes, this is a fly. This one should be seen around your house in some of your neighborhoods. Okay, next one, another shiny green thing. Okay, so what we're going to look for, let's look at the head. Not very huge eyes, does have long antennas, and it's kind of fuzzy in the picture, but you can see some pollen collecting hairs. And this one is indeed a bee. Okay, last one. This one's going to be a trickiest one. So I'm not going to walk you through it. I'll let you mentally walk through it yourself. And if you're with someone, you can yell out to them, I know what that is. But I'll wait for a second. Okay, so this one is also a fly. It's a really good mimic of a bumblebee, but if you look at the legs, they're pretty skinny. Yep. You look at the eyes, they're pretty big, almost touching on the top of the head. And look at those little short antennas with the 3 segments, right? There's that big fin and then the little hair thing. So that is a fly. It's a really good mimic of a bee, but it is a fly. So now we are all experts. You can tell the difference between flies and bees. But what about wasps? So I think we do have another poll question next, and I think Olivia is going to walk you through this one. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, so bees and wasps. And now I want you to know that technically bees and wasps are very close relatives to each other, such that if you talk to a true taxonomist, he or she would tell you that the bee is technically a kind of wasp, which can make it a little tricky. Nonetheless, there are some differences, and they're important differences, both ecologically, but also in terms of what you're trying to see in your yard. So we'll go again with a poll here, and I'm not going to give you very long on this one because I want you to just go with your gut reaction here. How many of these images, 1 image, 2, 3, or 4, are bees? How many of these images are bees? Go ahead and take just a second. I'm going to wait till we get to 40. I'll just wait for 40. We're at 30 seconds. 40, look at that. Good, most of you got it. And so the one that's the bee is in the lower right corner there. That is the bee, and the other 3 are flies, wasps. And if we take a moment, we can see that there are actually some features on these that are pretty distinctive that can help us tell them apart. So let's talk through a few of the things that help us with your classic bee and your classic wasp. Generally speaking, because a wasp is a predator that's out looking for prey that it hunts the same way a mountain lion or a great blue heron does, it has features that are for that sort of life cycle. So when you look at these, you'll see that they're quite often hairless. They don't have a lot of hair. The hair would get in the way. Hair on a bee helps them gather pollen, and so the hair comes in handy on the bee. Typically, and this isn't true of all wasps, but typically they have a thinner waist. So sort of the change from the thorax to the abdomen is often much, much thinner. There are exceptions to this. If you look at the one in the upper left corner, it doesn't look quite as thin as on that bee there, or on the other 2 wasps. And then if you look at the legs, they tend to be longer. They often use these long legs to sort of wrap around their prey and help them carry it back. And so those long legs come in handy, especially with all of those little tiny spines on them to help them hold on to something. So that's bees versus wasps in a nutshell. So now that you're an expert, let's take this quiz one more time here. Oh, I missed a slide. This should have come first. Bees eat the pollen. This is the part I wanted to point out earlier. Bees eat pollen, and the wasps are the meat eaters. So you can see over on the left side there, you can see that's a katydid, and the wasp is pulling off a chunk of it, going to take it back to its nest, and she'll feed it to her babies so they can grow up and repeat the process. The bee, on the other hand, is collecting the pollen that it will take back to the nest for its babies, for her babies, and that's what they'll eat as they're growing up. You can sometimes see silver on the face of a few wasps, and I often see wasps they walk around, they kind of shake their wings, and they have more of a slow meandering sort of flight compared to the bees when you see them in action. Okay, now am I ready for the poll?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I mean, it's a not official poll, but it's a mental poll.
Yes, here we go. So in your head, think to yourself, based on those characteristics, do you think this one is a wasp or a bee? This is a wasp, and you can see those longer legs. You can see the lack of hair. You can see that really thin little abdomen there where it transitions from the thorax. All of these are ways to kind of identify that wasp. And to me, they hold their wings in kind of often these long, linear sort of thin wings compared to the bee's wings. How about this one? It's got the same coloring. It's got the same markings that you might see on a wasp. And so it might be tempting to think that. But look at how thick those legs are. Look at how there aren't as many little spines on them at all. The body's a little bit chunkier, and I, as an expert, can even see the pollen collecting hairs on the underside of the abdomen. All of those features tell me that that one is a bee. Okay.
Okay, so one more. I think this is our last official poll question. So we have 4 insects on here again, and we're going to ask the same question: is how many of these images are bees? So like Olivia did, I will just let you look at it very briefly, and we'll try to get to our 40 votes.
A lot of people say there's one picture of a bee on here.
Yeah.
They must have been paying attention.
Okay, we're at 40, and you can keep voting while I talk. So this is a trick slide. We have that same bee on the bottom right? We have seen this bee lots of times now. It's our best friend, and somebody is going to make a plush toy animal of it. These other 3 are also bees. So the correct answer was all 4 of these were bees. And only 6% of you got that answer, and that is because we kind of tricked you.
Yeah.
Because the features we just pointed out, the differences between bees and wasps, Olivia had a key word in there when she said it. She said a standard bee and a standard wasp. Because we think of those wasps we showed, those were yellow jackets and those were mud dauber wasps. And then that's a big fuzzy bee like we think of. But these 3 other insects are also bees. And so we point this out because not all bees have that stereotypical, lovable, fuzzy bee shape to them. These are all pollinating bees. They feed their babies pollen. One of them is kind of a weird exception that we won't get into these details about, but they are bees. They do have, some skinny legs and other things, but unfortunately, the one key physical feature that separates bees from wasps is that bees somewhere on their body have branched hairs, kind of like hairs that look like little teeny feathers. Some of them only have it around this little shoulder area right there or right there. If you looked under a microscope, you'd see that these hairs are also branched, but most of us aren't in our flower garden with a microscope.
Right.
And so we need to kind of get to know the different kinds of bees. And so we can say, oh, that is a bee because it's this kind of bee. Do you have anything else you want to say about this one?
That's great. No, and I think that's really the key. So for most bees that you're looking at, you'll be able to know instantly that it's a bee because it's fuzzy and fluffy and cute. And if it was giant, you would hug it. But there are a few exceptions. There are some bees that have this sort of different look to them. There are reasons in each case. And when I'm teaching like bee workshops that last for several days, those are the ones that you just memorize. You memorize that when you see that particular look, you know that that is a certain kind of bee. And that's the way you have to handle those. Shall we walk through a few of these?
Let's do it.
All right. So we thought we'd walk you through just a few of the common bees that you might see in the DC area so that when you see them, you can wow your friends and just be like, oh yeah, that's a bombus. It's just your standard bumblebee. Bumblebees is the one we're going to start with because they're big and fluffy and easy to see, and they're really common right now. They're out on all of the flowers in your yards, in your natural spaces, wherever you are. Worldwide, there's about 250 species, and most of them are found north of the equator. Here in the eastern US, where you guys are, or at least most of you, there's maybe 30 different species. Go forward one slide,
Yeah,
Joe.
sorry.
Good. Around 30 species, and in the DC area and surrounding states, there's about 16 species. Some of them are really rare and you'll never see them, and some are pretty common. They're all really important pollinators, and they're generalists, which means they'll visit any flower that they happen to see in an area. They start their colonies over every year from one queen that overwinters, and she'll start a colony, so she's a social insect, primitively social, as they say. And one of the few, so honeybees and bumblebees are kind of the two social species that we have, or groups that we have in this country.
Yeah, and so sorry to interrupt. Someone actually asked a question about that. Asked what percentage of bees of the 4,000 are social, and so it's less than 5% really. Like Olivia just said, bumblebees are one of them, and then there's some others that are kind of less social. It's kind of a spectrum, I guess you could say.
Yep. It's a spectrum. Yeah. So the most social obviously would be the honeybee. Bumblebees are just under that. And then you can move down to ones that are complete introverts and hang out by themselves all the time. There's a whole range there.
Yep.
So let's talk about some of the things that we can use to identify a bumblebee and recognize it. They're fairly easy to identify. They're huge. They tend to be bigger than most of the other things that you see. They're slightly smaller in the summer because those are the worker bees and not the queens, and they're a little bit smaller. They often have long faces, really long, sort of somber looking faces. And the males and females both have a lot of yellow and orange, maybe black, maybe some white bands on the bodies, but it's all hair. The body itself is solid black. So there's no yellow markings on the face in males or in females. On the hind leg, do you remember I talked about those grocery bags, those big scopal hairs on the hind legs? If you look at a bumblebee, the hind leg, instead of having scopal hairs, actually has this sort of flattened spoon-like structure right here, and it collects pollen. She collects pollen and nectar kind of mixed together as a mud into this structure. So go forward. There we go. You can see some of that pollen and nectar kind of mixed together right there, which is a little different than how most bees collect their pollen to take back to the nest. Underneath that, there's another structure that you can see that's called the base of tarsus, and that one, there you go, tends to be kind of enormous and really square, and that's pretty unique to the bumblebee. So that long face, lots and lots of yellow and black and orange hair, an interesting shaped back leg are all really important features for telling bumblebees from all of the other bees in the DC area.
Was there one more feature on here? Let me see if I missed one. Oh, did you want to mention the jugal lobe?
If you get really technical, and we won't today, you could also look at the hind wing and see that there's some interesting missing wing characters that are found in a lot of other bees that are totally absent from this particular bee. They're most similar to the Carpenter bees, but I'll let Joe walk you through that when we get down to Carpenter bees here in a minute. So go forward. Here we go. Good. So I want to walk you through two main bumblebees that you'll see in the area. These ones are super common. The first is called the two-spotted bumblebee. There's lots and lots of features you can look at, but the main one really is that the thorax, all of that hair is bright yellow on the back of the thorax there. The first part of the abdomen has a yellow band, but then underneath that are these two little yellow tufts of hair on the second part of the abdomen called the second tergal segment. So that makes it the two-spotted bumblebee, and those two yellow spots are pretty easy to see even when the bee's sort of flying around fast. The next one that's pretty common in the area is the common eastern bumblebee. This one right here, you'll see it looks a lot like the other, but look, those two yellow spots are missing. So it only has yellow, and in this picture, it's a little tawny. She's just like humans have different hair colors, that happens in bees too. But it's only on that first segment of the abdomen, and the two yellow spots are missing from the rest. There's one other, and I'll just mention it really briefly. You'll see it out there as well. It's not quite as common. It's the brown-belted bumblebee, and here the distinction between the yellow and orange hair on the abdomen is pretty obvious. So that sort of contrasting pattern will help you identify the brown-belted. So in your area, just start simple. Start by recognizing that, oh my gosh, there's a bumblebee, and you can recognize them, and they're pretty easy to figure out. And then with practice, you can start working on how to tell the different kinds apart.
So Olivia mentioned that one of the bees that often is most similar to bumblebees are the Carpenter bees. So Carpenter bees are in the genus Xylocopa. Around the world, there's about 500 species found on nearly every continent, most diverse, like in Southeast Asia, where they have blue ones and yellow ones and black and white ones, really, really pretty colors. In the US, there are 9 species in North America. 2 of them live in the East. And of those 2, one of them is only found in Florida. So if you are in the Eastern US, not in Florida, you are probably seeing this Carpenter bee, which is Xylocopa virginica. And so Xylocopa, if we break apart that genus name, xylo means wood, copa means head. So officially that genus is a woodhead bee. And it's because, as the name suggests, they are carpenter bees. They have these really kind of big round heads with massive jaws, and they chew into old dead wood. Naturally, they would chew into dead tree stumps. In your yards, they might chew into your mailbox or your fence posts or to the eaves of your house or your deck. Carpenter bees are interesting because they live communally in these nests. They're not social, they're solitary bees, but sometimes they share a nest entrance, probably because it's a little bit easier to chew into the wood once, and then they'll dig off and dig their own tunnels into these little nest parts. Let me just get to the right screen here so I can see again. Identifying features of carpenter bees, because when you first look at them, they do look kind of like bumblebees. But one of the big key things to look at is the head. They're a big bee. They have a really round face. Unlike the bumblebees, which have the face that's kind of narrow, the carpenter bee's face is really round, and then the males have yellow on their face. So if we look at the face of the male, big eyes with this big yellow upper lip. As Olivia mentioned, no bumblebees have yellow or white markings on the skin itself. They just have yellow hairs. So you can look for those yellow markings on these big bees. The eastern carpenter bee has kind of this blonde colored sweater that it wears on its thorax. So the males have it with the yellow on the face. The females also have the yellow sweater that they're wearing, but their face is all black. But their head is really round. unlike the bumblebees. One other key thing to look at that might be a little bit trickier to get used to is looking at the back legs. Bumblebees have those pollen baskets, those corbicula that they stuff the pollen into that Olivia talked about, kind of like a Play-Doh. Carpenter bees have big scopal hairs. So they have these thick, bristly hairs on their back legs that bumblebees don't have. So if you can see the back legs and you see big hairy back legs, you know it's a carpenter bee rather than a bumblebee.
One of my other favorite things to point out on these guys is the carpenter bee, the females, you can think of it as a shiny hiney. So she's all polished. Her whole abdomen is really polished because there's no yellow and black hair on it like there is in the bumblebee.
I like that. I haven't used shiny hiney, but now I'm going to. Yeah, because bumblebees have black hair if they're like the eastern bumblebee. It has a black abdomen, but it's not shiny because it's all covered with hair. Very cool.
Hair.
I like it.
Okay, so another one, and this one's flying right now where you are. This one's the Woolcarter bees. There's, again, so many species worldwide, but there's also quite a few here in North America. In the East, we only have 4 species, 2 of which aren't very common unless you're hiking in the woods, and 2 of which occur in neighborhoods all the time. Interestingly, the 2 that are common in our cities are both not native to this country and have come over fairly recently. Nonetheless, they are bees, they are there, and they still do pollination even though they are not native species. And the 2 things that are most easy to recognize on these guys are the yellow and black body. It's sort of this short, compact little body. They look like little football players almost, little round helmets and shoulder pads and everything. And they hover around flowers. So if you see a little tiny yellow and black bee, you can almost hear them in the air as they're hovering near your flowers. You're looking at a Woolcarter bee. You can see that they collect pollen on the underside of the abdomen. Go forward one more, Joe. Let's take a look. You have to go 2, I think.
Sure.
There we go. If you zoom in on this abdomen here, you can see on the underside there, she collects her pollen on her belly. So you can see that there's an arrow. Push one more time, the arrow will pop up there. And that's a really distinctive feature for this particular kind of bee. So the yellow and black, the hovering, and the pollen on the underside of the abdomen are all really good characters for identifying these. If you wanted to get technical, you could look between the front toes especially, and if you see this little teeny tiny pad, you know you're looking at a Woolcarter bee. It's the strangest thing. Some of them have it and some of them don't. These ones don't. And then if you go forward one more, here we go. Woolcarter bees, the thing that makes these guys so cool to me is their mandibles, the face scissors we talked about early on. They've got lots and lots of teeth. You can think of them as the dinosaurs with all of their teeth here, but it's a tiny little bee. They've got these huge mandibles with all the teeth. And now I'd like to show you what they do with all of those teeth. They actually use them to shear plant fuzz off of plants. So they'll actually shave it off a little bit, and then they'll take all of that plant fuzz that they've shaved off, roll it up into a cute little cotton ball that they'll take back to the nest and put in as padding for their offspring, for their little babies, which is pretty cool.
I was just showing it one more time to see that fuzzy ball of pollen, of plant fuzz.
Plant fuzz.
They
only can do this on certain ones, and it means that sometimes you'll see these guys not visiting flowers, but actually visiting the leaves themselves, which is a little different than a lot of other bees that focus just on the flowers. The kind that you see in your yards, one of them is a little bit larger than your standard Woolcarter bee, and this is the male. It's the genus and species is Amphidium manicotum, and it's the European Woolcarter bee. And they're a bit aggressive. They'll be aggressive to people. I've had them actually try and bonk me in the head to get me to leave an area where they thought I was intruding on their territory. But if they find another insect in their territory, they'll actually take those teeth that they have on the hind end of their body there and curl their abdomen under and puncture the exoskeleton of the other insect and can do some pretty serious damage. So they're fairly formidable. And what's amazing is you can actually see those teeth when they're flying. So you can see that in the air, those giant teeth on the backside. Most bees aren't as aggressive as these guys are, but there's always an exception. These guys look most similar to wasps. So there's a wasp in the upper left and a bee in the lower right, and you can see how they do look fairly similar to each other. But notice that even on this fairly not hairy bee, there's still more hair than there is on your standard wasp. And look at how thick the bee's legs are compared to the wasp legs. So There are definite differences if you take the time to really get to know these guys. The eyes to me are also pretty different, but that's a whole topic in and of itself.
Yeah, so we're running a little bit short on time, so we have 2 more groups of bees that we want to talk about. Oh, there's the Anthidium and there's the wasp. Sorry, Olivia said all this, so I should have clicked through it, and I failed. The next one, this is called a squash bee. It used to be in the genus Peponapus. Now that is called a subgenus of the genus Eucera. But there's 11 species of these squash bees in the world. All of them are in Mexico and the U.S. There are only two species in this subgenus in the U.S. They are all specialists on squash plants. So that means they only collect pollen and feed their babies pollen from squash plants. That includes, zucchinis and pumpkins and things like that. They're very common in our gardens if we plant squash. And in fact, they nest right in the ground around the squash plants. So they're at first they look like honeybees, but they can be kind of easy to distinguish from honeybees. And so here's some of the characteristics. They have this kind of reddish orangish hair on the thorax and then white hair bands on their abdomen. The clypeus, which is kind of the nose part of the bee, that upper lip, it sticks out a lot from the face. So if you look at it from the side, it has this kind of big bulbous nose, and the males, like this one in this picture, has a white spot on it. Honeybees don't have that. They don't have that look to them, so you can tell them apart from honeybees that way. Also, these squash bees don't have a lot of hair on their legs compared to similar bees. They still do carry pollen on their back legs, but they're not as densely hairy as some other bees. They look a lot like other longhorn bees or digger bees, and we're not really going to focus on those other bees. But so this is a pumpkin flower in my yard. This is a female squash bee. You often see them this way with their hind end facing up, and you see those white hair bands. She was just drinking nectar. You can see her tongue was out. Now she's spending some time cleaning herself. She has pollen on her face and on her legs and on her body. So she first cleans off her eyes, and she cleans off her tongue, and she's moving all of that pollen down her body. She just transferred it from the front legs to the middle legs. She's still grooming herself and getting herself all clean. In a second right here, she's now moving that pollen to her back legs so she can carry it back to her nest. Along comes a male, and his interest is not pollen. He wants to just mate. And in fact, squash bees, unlike most other bees, the males do the majority of the pollination in some of these pumpkin patches because the males are flying quickly from flower to flower looking for females. They don't spend the time to clean themselves off like the females do, and so they end up transferring a lot of pollen between male and female flowers. So because of the time, we're going to move on to the last group. Do you want me to do this one, Olivia?
Yeah, go for it.
So one of the ones that I love, especially because of their color, are these, they call them the metallic green sweat bees. There's actually 5 species of metallic green sweat bees in 3 genera in the tribe Ogochlorinae. So there are several different metallic green bees that look similar to this. The Ogochlorinae are going to be some of the most common in the DC area. In fact, most of the eastern US. There's one common species in each of these genera. Ogochlora pura nests in old dead logs, so it's often found in the woods. Ogocloropsis metallica and Ogochlorella aurata are both ground nesting bees, and so they'll be found often they nest in kind of sunny patches of dirt. They are active most of the year from the late spring through the fall. They're kind of medium to small sized bees. One of the easy ways to identify them is that color. They're this bright metallic green, sometimes with some copper undertones, sometimes with bluish undertones, really pretty bees. If you can look closely at the face, you see that their eye has this notch on the inner margin of it. That's to help separate it from some other metallic green bees that just have kind of a straight margin to the eye. Also down here by the clypeus, which is this portion right there, like the upper lip, they have this notch, can help you distinguish the shape of that notch, helps you distinguish among the genera, can be pretty tricky. There's another fairly common in some areas metallic green sweat bee in the genus Agapostemon. The Ogochlorinae, you can tell them apart because this is called the propodium. It's the kind of the back end of that middle section of the bee. It has a smooth transition from the top surface to the side surface. Just this little bump right here. If you get our book that comes out next month, you can compare it to the Agapostemon, which has a kind of a raised ridge, a ridge separating those two parts of the body. So Metallic green sweat bees are pretty common in most of our yards. They're generalist pollinators. They visit lots of kind of flowers. They're really pretty. When you first see them, you might assume they're a fly because of their color, but they are a nice, pretty bee. This is the agapostemon I was talking about that has a raised ridge around that part. Also, one of the common agapostemon species in the East, it has black and white stripes on its abdomen, and the agochlorine bees do not have that. So we are basically out of time. There are lots of questions, and we'll be able to get to some of them. We wanted to put this up here. We had this earlier on, but if you want to take a screenshot or take a picture with your phone, we are moderately active on social media. Sometimes our field season and our families take priority, but that's okay because they should. But if you want to contact us, these are various ways. You can go through our website, which is beesinyourbackyard.com, or Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. If you look up the Bees in Your Backyard, you'll probably find us. Or you can email us at thebeesinyourbackyard@gmail. If you have pictures of an insect you think, is this a bee? Send it to us and we will probably answer you. Depends on how long we're out in the field. But look us up. Anything else you want to say there, Olivia?
No, that's great. Thank you all for tuning in today so that you could learn a little bit about bees. I hope it was helpful. And if there's anything that we went a little fast and it was hard for you to understand, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Joe's done a great job of posting some videos online lately that might help with some of your questions about bees in your yards. And then there's other online references as well. I answered a few of the questions over in the chat that I thought were rather specific to a person, but there's a couple here I see that maybe everyone would be interested in. So this one says, Eva asks, can we assume if the insect is in a flower, it's not a wasp, but that it might be a fly? And I would say wasps, flies, bees, butterflies, all of these different things are visiting the flower for that wonderful nectar resource that the flower puts out there. And they're getting dusted with pollen in the process. But wasps visit flowers probably as often as flies do, just for that nectar resource. So I don't think we can make that assumption. Unfortunately, it would sure make it easier if we could, but
yeah.
I don't think we can.
And because of that, because they're using the nectar the flowers differently, right? Nectar versus pollen and nectar. Sometimes bees will spend more time on a flower,
Right.
But that's not always the case, right? There's another question that I wanted to address. It's Michelle asks about bees besides honeybees that are used for agriculture. Sometimes me and Olivia will give talks and we'll specifically talk about agricultural types of settings. Here we wanted to introduce you to some of these bees. And it's an interesting question because it really depends on the context. But in smaller farms or in backyard gardens, a lot of these wild bees, these native bees, are doing the majority of the pollination. And so if we provide habitat for these bees in our yards or around some of these smaller farms, they will do most of the pollination. In other parts of the country where we have these really large farms, thousands of acres, because we haven't provided habitat in those thousands of acres, there's often not place for these wild bees to live. Around the margins of the field, they'll be there, but they're not going to fly 1,000 acres into the center of the field. And so our agriculture system has been kind of reliant on honeybees, which you can drive in a truck out into the field. So there is a lot of work being done looking at how wild bees affect agriculture, and there's work done by the USDA and other groups trying to see how we can kind of encourage these wild bees to be used in these larger scale agriculture settings. And there are some successes and some failures, but the trickiest part is if we kind of continue to rely on these giant fields of monoculture crops, it's harder for these wild bees to do the job that they have evolved to be really good at.
And what they're finding pretty consistently across those areas is when they do make the effort or find a way to incorporate whatever wild insects are in the area. And this is true around the world. I gave a talk on this on Wednesday. Those native insects, those wild insects that are there, most of which are wild bees, increase seed set dramatically in ways that adding more honeybees never could. So you can keep adding and adding honeybees and you won't get higher seed set. But when you incorporate another group, a different kind of pollinator, you can increase seed set pretty dramatically. I see a question here that says, why is it called a sweat bee? What's the connection? That's a great question. Interestingly, about sweat bees, this is the strangest thing. Oh, Joe, I see. Do you want to answer?
No, I clicked it so you could answer it.
Okay. The interesting thing about sweat bees is that for whatever reason, they actually do visit your skin and the skin of other organisms to get that little bit of sweat off of you. So you will have them land on you, and if you hold still, you can actually watch them kind of tap at your skin and lap up a little bit of that sweat. And this is true around the world. They weren't named in North America. They were named in Europe first, and they're called sweat bees because even over there they do that. Crazy. Let's see what else is in here.
Oh, so there's one that I've been asked before about Varroa mites.
Yeah.
So Varroa mites. So honeybees are faced with a lot of different threats. And because we rely on them for agriculture, there's a lot of research and attention focused on honeybees. One of the major threats currently to honeybees is this mite called the Varroa mite. It's a parasitic mite that is bad for honeybee colonies. It's from the same parts of the world that the honeybees are from, but it was absent from, the parasite was absent from North America until the 80s. So from the 80s, over the last 30, 40 years, Varroa mites have spread across the country, and they've become a big problem for honeybees. And so beekeepers have to do a lot of work to monitor their mites and treat for their mites. But the Varroa mite is a specific parasite on honeybees, and the way they parasitize this highly social organism doesn't transfer to these wild bees. Now, there are other pathogens and parasites that do transfer between honeybees and wild bees, but the Varroa mite isn't one of them. But there are viruses and there's other things that will transfer between them. So even on a flower, an infected bee could leave behind some pathogens on the flower, and then the wild bees can come to that flower and get infected. One thing to think about that we're all really familiar with now because of coronavirus is that social distancing reduces the spread of pathogens. And honeybees are not very good at social distancing. There's 50,000 bees in their hive. And so at night, all 50,000 bees, or roughly all of them, are in there not distancing. But these solitary native bees are good at social distancing. Sometimes they share a front door. Most of the time they live by themselves. And so the pathogens and parasites don't spread as rapidly among the native bees as they do among the highly social bees like the honeybees.
Yeah.
Bumble bees also have a higher parasite spread and a higher parasite load, and it probably related to that social lifestyle they have.
Irene asks a question. She says, what are the bees that live in large communities with each female having her own nest? They're smallish. So the bees that I can think of, especially in the East, Irene, I'm making an assumption here that you are in the East, would be, I'm guessing not a honeybee. So bumblebees, but they tend to be bigger, and they nest with one female has her own nest and all of her own sisters or daughters helping her out in there. But there are others that we call semi-social. So they're social, but not in the sense that they divide up labor so much. They're social in the sense that they live in the same area, and females kind of vie for being the one in charge of laying the eggs, and it can change who's in charge there and how that's going. But those are mostly in the sweat bee group. So the family is called Halictidae, and it includes Halictus. It includes some of those ogochlorines that we talked about, and some of the Lasioglossum, which is another group of sweat bees. So my guess is if they're smallish, that what you're talking about or what you've seen around is something in that group, something in either the Halictus or the Lasioglossum group.
And there's one other option. It depends on, I'm not exactly sure also, Irene, what you're seeing, but each female having their own nest. There are several solitary bees that do nest in big groups, kind of like a bee neighborhood. And so there are several different mining bees and digger bees. And in fact, most ground nesting bees, if they find a good patch of dirt that they like, a lot of different bees will nest there. Sometimes there's 100 nests, in 1 square meter or more. And so you have several individual nests. They're not sharing any work, but they live in a neighborhood. And so it's just like humans do. We find a good spot and we say, hey, let's build a neighborhood here. Yeah. But we all have our own house and we work for our own support and things like that. So a lot of bees will do that. So
good. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That makes sense. Joe, how would you answer this one? How beneficial is it to bees if you allow clover flowers to grow in your lawn?
Oh, I love that question.
My neighbors don't care for it, and I'd like to have a good reply.
Yeah, so there is a movement, an anti-mowing movement. It's mostly Midwest and East. In Utah, where I'm at, it's not the same, right? If I don't mow my lawn, I don't get the same kind of beneficial weeds. So the answer is mixed. Some bees really like clover. Some bees really like mint. Some bees really like sunflowers. But the bees that like sunflowers might not even, their brain might not even tell them clover is an option. You know, they are pre-programmed to have certain food sources, and they might not even recognize the other ones. So clover can be good for some bees, especially in the Midwest and the East. There are several bees that do feed on clover. And part of what Olivia and I have preached for a long time is that if we can provide some habitat for bees in our yards, we can be kind of making up for that dramatic habitat change that happened when our neighborhoods came in. So providing habitat includes food like clover, but they also need places to nest, which means some bare dirt. So it's a hard thing, because we often want well manicured yards, but bees don't like well manicured yards. They like a little bit of messiness.
Disturbance.
Yeah, disturbance. Disturbance is often attractive to a lot of bees. So your neighbors might just have to get used to it. But there's a balancing act. It's really interesting. There was a study out of Michigan that showed if you don't mow your lawn, it's not that if you don't mow it, you continually get an increase in bees. Because at some point it gets so long that you get less bees and the weeds take over and you get less bees. And so I think they said the sweet spot was like 3 weeks, mow it once every 3 weeks or something like that. Does that sound right, Olivia?
That does sound right. Yep.
And so yes, some disturbance is good for bees. And if you can leave some clover, it's also good. My first experience in the world with bees was stepping on honeybees barefoot in clover, and it was not a good experience.
We've all had that experience.
Yeah. And so the answer is it is beneficial, but it's more beneficial to have a diversity of native flowers. I sometimes pick on Morgan Freeman because he's a movie star, and people pick on movie stars. He has a ranch in Mississippi, and he converted this ranch into a bee sanctuary, which is awesome. But part of what he did, at least what was reported that he did, is he planted fields of lavender and clover for the bees, and then he brought in a bunch of honeybees. What he didn't recognize is that honeybees aren't a wild animal. They're not the native bees that maybe used to live on his ranch before he brought the honeybees in. And not all wild bees like lavender and clover. And so it's the same with our yards on a smaller scale. If we just let the clover grow, it is pretty invasive. That's why it's in our grass in the first place. And same with dandelions. Dandelions aren't like the only thing the bees need. There are a lot of native flowers that bloom early that are probably better for a diversity of bees. And so the more mixed we can make our yards in terms of floral diversity, the more kinds of bees they can support.
Yeah, it depends probably a little bit on your neighbor too, and what sort of approach is going to work for this particular person. But I mean, the general gist is that what you're creating is an Airbnb. Get it?
Yeah.
You're creating a food and a place to live. That's all that the bee needs. And food can be interpreted so many ways, just as it is with humans. And so what's important is that you're providing food for at least some of those bees when you have the clover in there. So I don't know if there's a compromise between you and your neighbor where you can mow periodically, but let that clover be there for as long as possible, just because those native bees there are struggling and they're having a hard time because we keep modifying their habitat, and any little bit that we can do makes you a better human.
So there's another question, Olivia, that you might be better to answer. So we have Carpenter bees out here in the West, but our Carpenter bees in the West don't seem to be quite as comfortable living in our yards as the Eastern Carpenter bees do. And so let's see who asked the question.
Oh, I see it.
You see it? Okay. It was Holly. Carpenter bees are on the porch, and are they undermining the structure? Are they beneficial, or are they a problem that should be eradicated? I don't know if you have any thoughts about this with your time in the East.
So probably for you, it's a little bit of both. They're definitely a problem because of what they're doing to your deck. And for that reason, I would say they probably should be eradicated. I love Carpenter bees very much, but there's plenty of native sort of natural habitats that they could move into instead and not destroy your deck. Yes, they are good pollinators, absolutely, especially if you have stuff around there. They're generalists and they're big and they can carry a lot of pollen and move a lot from flower to flower. So it's sort of a toss-up. If you're willing to let your deck be sacrificed for the sake of or your porch be sacrificed for the sake of the pollination that they're doing, then that's great. But if not, you could be forgiven for asking them to move on somewhere else. What you could do, if it works for you, is let them see out the seasons, right? So wait until the fall when they've kind of gone back into hibernation and they're waiting for the next year, and then plug up that nest and seal it so that they're sealed in, and then whichever ones are in the area can find a new place for the next year. So little bit of both there. It's a gray area on that one for sure. Jenny asks about the damage mosquito spraying has on native bees. My understanding is that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about this and that spraying is harmful to the bees, but we don't yet have anything quantitative that says how bad and under which situations it happens to be super detrimental. Mosquito spraying, it's an insecticide, and bees and mosquitoes are both insects, so it's very possible that spraying is damaging them, but to what extent and under what circumstances still unfortunately remains to be seen. I have had a lot of people tell me that when their neighbors sprayed for mosquitoes, they saw changes in the native bees in their yards. So even before something quantitative comes out, I think there is sort of a consensus that it can be detrimental on a local scale.
And one of the differences, a lot of the mosquito spray studies have been done on honeybees, and so they can close the door effectively of the honeybee hive while they spray. And then when the spray has kind of dissipated, they let the honeybees out. The difference is since 80% of the native bees are nesting in the ground, that spray is falling onto the ground, and we don't know what that's doing. We don't know because they're crawling then through the contaminated soil or they're digging through the contaminated soil. So it's a different kind of ball game, and the studies really aren't done yet to see. It's a lot harder to study a native bee that lives by itself because you can't bring that into the lab as easy as you can a honeybee.
Right. Here, Joe. You have some of these bee houses that have been successful. Tell us what you think about this. I have a bee nest for mason bees. Last year, the holes were filled by mid-April, but the mud got broken and all gone by the end of August of the same year. So what happened? Did some parasitic bees take over, or were they destroyed by other things? What do you think?
There's probably an answer is yes, maybe. So it's not satisfying. Yes to both things. So I do have I call them bee hotels in my yard. And one of the benefits of bee hotels is it provides habitat for these cavity nesting bees. One of the downfalls of them is you are concentrating bees into one little small area. And back to that social distancing idea is in nature, they are looking for holes in dead pieces of wood, which are kind of scattered around the forest. When we have a bee hotel in our yard, we have concentrated those nesting spots into a non-social distanced environment. And so there are some pathogens like fungus that can affect your bees, but that's not going to break the mud out. There are parasites that affect your bees. There's parasitic bees, but there's also a lot of parasitic wasps. And those parasitic wasps will actually dig through the mud cap and lay their egg inside that bee nest. So it could be parasitic wasps or parasitic bees. Also, woodpeckers or other birds will also sometimes dig out that mud because there are nice little protein packets in there in the form of baby bees. And so bee hotels are good, but there is a study that suggested that they're not maybe the best way to save the bees because we're artificially concentrating them in an area, and then the social distancing benefits are lost. I'm actually thinking about this summer, my bee hotels are very much being infiltrated by parasitic wasps. And so I think in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to do a YouTube video about that because I'm not a very good hotel owner. I don't clean out my bee nests and I don't, change the sheets, so to speak. And so I get parasitic wasps, but it'll be a nice illustration of why social distancing is good in the bee.
And one thing that you can do is, so, if you think about it in terms of the natural environment, a bee hotel represents this stable, permanent structure that the bees come back to, but that's not how it really works. Usually the bees that emerge find a new place to nest every year, so they're not coming back, which means that the pathogen load can't build up as high. and that the parasites have to search every year to find them again. There's no memory of where they found something good the year before. So moving your bee nests around, moving your little bee houses so they're not always in the same location, and putting in new tubes can definitely help with that a little bit. And that, I think, answers also a question that Kay had about that. I think we have time for one last question here, Joe. And I remember reading about this, but I don't remember the details specifically. So I'm going to check if you do. Maybe neither of us does here, but do you remember? I remember reading about that honeybee fossil found in Nevada. It's really old though, and it's not Apis mellifera.
No, right? It's not Apis mellifera. I believe it was neogene. Neogene is something like 16 million years ago, something like that. I think Timothy, does that sound right? Is it neogene? I don't know if he can answer his own question. But so yes, there is one fossil from Nevada. It's a fossil in shale, I believe, and they know it's a honeybee because of the wing venation. Honeybee broadly, meaning it's in that same broad category. There's something like 8 honeybee species around the world. 1 or 2 of them are the ones that we use agriculturally. So it is a relative of the honeybee we have today. So when we say honeybees weren't here, they're not native here. They were brought over, the current honeybees we have across North and South America were brought over by European settlers 500 years ago. So they've been here for a long time. They are not native to North and South America. There is one that was alive millions of years ago and apparently was extinct shortly after, because there's no records, no evidences besides that one fossil. When I say this, sometimes people often say, well, there are honeybees down in Mexico. And it's true. In the tropics, there is a different group of bees called stingless bees, melaponine bees, and they do make some honey. Some of it was some species were kept by the Mayans in like hollow logs, and they could have harvestable honey from that. But they are strictly tropical. None of those are north of the transvolcanic Mexican belt, kind of in central Mexico. It doesn't get up into the deserts currently. If you look back 30 million years ago, there was fossils of them from New Jersey when it was more tropical in New Jersey. So yes, over the last 30 million years, things have changed quite a bit.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia and Joe, for this fantastic presentation. And thank you to our participants for joining us today.